Welcome back, people. So what we're now going to look at are controls on delegated legislation. Now, these fall into two categories, and exam questions are likely to ask you on just one of the two categories. So we're going to look at parliamentary controls. So remember, Parliament has given all this power away, and it has to control it just a little bit, has to retain control, otherwise councils could be doing crazy things. So we're going to look at parliamentary controls, and then the other option is control by judges, so judicial controls. So let's look at parliamentary controls first of all. There are 5 different things we are going to talk about. So the first, something called a scrutiny committee. Okay, so a scrutiny committee is a committee that reviews statutory instruments, and as it says, they scrutinise, they check the delegated legislation, and they can refer them back to Parliament. So it's like a government kind of department that will then look at things, so scrutinise them, and if they don't like the delegated legislation, they don't like the statutory instruments, they'll refer it back to Parliament. So that's good, that is a control. The next thing is the Parent or Enabling Act. So remember, this is the initial act of Parliament that gives the power away. So like the National Minimum Wage Act says, Department for Work and Pensions can change the law every year. But in that act, it may say that there are limits on what type of laws can be changed. So it may say that you can change the amount every single year of the minimum wage, but it may actually limit things, saying, well, you can't scrap it, or you can't double it, or things like that. So that's another thing, the actual Parent or Enabling Act itself. The third type of parliamentary control, affirmative resolution procedure. Remember that statutory instruments don't become law until they've been approved by Parliament. So police powers under the Police and Criminal Evidence Act 1984 have to be approved by Parliament. So if they make any changes to PACE 1984, Parliament has to approve it. Negative resolution procedure is another form of control. That's, remember, where the statutory instrument automatically becomes law if Parliament don't reject it within 40 days. So it's less of a control, however, it still is there. They still have 40 days in which to reject the new law. And then the final parliamentary control is questioning by ministers, or questioning of ministers. So MPs in the House of Commons can question ministers about their work on the proposed or current delegated legislation. So those are controls by Parliament. Another type of question you might get asked is about judicial controls. So first of all, something called judicial review. So this is where an individual person, you or me, challenges the lawfulness of a public body's decision in court. And we would go to the Queen's Bench Division of the High Court. So judicial review, we as individuals are allowed to challenge laws. So that's good, that's a form of control. Now, some Latin for you, ultra vires. So ULTRA, and then a new word, VIRES, ultra vires. Now, literally translated, this means going beyond your powers. So a judicial control is if the delegated legislation goes beyond its powers. So if a council did something absolutely crazy and said, we're having a curfew at 8 o'clock every night, you could challenge the council. So I could challenge Norwich City Council and say, hang on a minute, that is ultra vires. You do not have the power to do that. And I would go to court and I would challenge it. And if the court agreed with me, they would say, yes, it is ultra vires. It goes beyond Norwich City Council's power. That law is now void. So splitting ultra vires up into 2 types, procedural ultra vires. So think it's got the word procedure in procedural ultra vires. Procedural ultra vires means that the secondary body, so the council or the relevant government department, hasn't followed the procedures set out in the Enabling or Parent Act. Good example of this is the Aylesbury mushroom case. So mushroom growers were meant to be consulted before regulations were written. They weren't, and the court said that they were acting. It was procedural ultra vires, so they ruled in favour of the mushroom growers. Okay. The other type of ultra vires is something called substantive. So you've got procedural ultra vires, substantive ultra vires. Substantive ultra vires means the lawmaking body has gone beyond its powers under the Parent Act. So procedural, they haven't followed the procedures. Substantive, they've gone beyond their powers. So A good example of this is the Anne Summers case. You're all going to remember this because you'll think Anne Summers, that's an easy one to remember. So Anne Summers versus the Job Centre. Department for Work of Pensions banned a job advert for Anne Summers because I think they thought it was like a sex shop and it was advertising sex and sex workers and so on. But what the courts actually turned around and said is that that job ad should not have been banned. So Anne Summers won the case. So the Department for Work and Pensions went beyond their powers. So that's an easy one to remember. So you've got mushrooms and a sex shop. The other thing just to bear in mind with judicial controls is something called the Wensbury. So WEDNESBURY, the Wensbury unreasonableness factor, I guess. So is the decision so unreasonable that a sensible person, whoever they are, would not have arrived at it? So the courts are basically doing, it's a reasonableness test. I mean, we've looked at Lord Denning, who thinks a reasonable man is the man on the Clapham omnibus. But when you're looking at judicial controls and have the body, has the council or the government body, have they gone beyond their powers? You look at, was it reasonable? So would a reasonable person have reached that decision? So those are the controls. There's going to be a video about how effective those controls are, and then there's going to be another evaluation one about good and bad things about delegated legislation.